Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you a wrap up of the horror and thriller books I've been reading recently. I have some new releases in here, some review copies, one of my most anticipated releases for the entire year, and a 5-star prediction. You can probably guess what I'm going to be talking about, as well as a book that I am kind of terrified to talk about because I'm embarrassed to admit that I enjoyed it. And we'll get to that in a moment, so let's get started. First, let's talk about horror, and I read Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes, and yes, this was one of my most anticipated releases. This was a 5-star prediction for me. This is a book that I have talked ad nauseum about on my channel. If you somehow do not know, this is a piece of space horror that I received from Tor Nightfire for review, and it follows a crew that investigates a luxury liner ship that has been missing for years and then is found. When they go to investigate, they find out that terrible things have ensued, and the ship just appears to be not quite right. And so it sounds like the premise of a haunted house story set in space, and I will say that the marketing around this book was a bit misleading in my opinion, because this book read less like space horror and more like a science fiction thriller set in space. And it's not to say that I didn't enjoy it, but I definitely did not love it as much as I thought I would. And a lot of it again comes down to tone, that for me it never really hit the horror tropes. It definitely had the tropes of a space opera, and it attempted to kind of hit those marks, but the actual tone of the story just never felt very suspenseful, very scary. And I think it was just the focus of the story, especially on the characters. It just felt a little bit too emotional for my taste. It had a bit of a romantic subplot, which I did not care for. You know me, I would always, almost always at least, rather skip over that aspect of books. And this one just left me again a little bit underwhelmed. Not to say that it wasn't a good book, I still gave it 3.5 stars, but I just wanted more from it. And again, from the marketing, from my impossible expectations, I thought I was going to love this book because I love space horror. And when it turned out not to be that, I was definitely underwhelmed. So I would really love to know, for all of you who have read this one, what you thought about it, because I know it is super buzzy right now, super popular, and I really want to hear if other people had the same experience or if they enjoyed it a little bit more than I did. Next up, we have Dracula Ascending by Sydney Winget, and this is a book that I received from the author for review, and this is a piece of Gothic horror that blends together the classic story of Frankenstein with the story of Dracula. Now, the basic premise is that at the start of the story, we follow the trial of Victor Frankenstein, who has been accused of several crimes, and then the story then jumps back in time to show us how it got to that point in time, how he got to the point of being prosecuted. And in the story you find out that he is just fascinated by this science and is interested in the idea of reanimation and bringing a creature to life. However, Frankenstein's monster in this case happens to be the creation that we would know as Dracula. And so it's the idea that Frankenstein is the creator of this vampiric monster. And I have to admit that I was a little nervous when I said yes to this one, only because I thought that the premise of this book could go in two different directions. Either it could be fantastic, because I am starting to like more modern takes on Gothic fiction, and this book was really promised to be that, or I was really worried that this book could be super, super cheesy. And I am pleased to report that, for me at least, I thought that it was really well done. I thought the tone was consistent. It was dark and gothic and foreboding, but at the same time, it was the kind of Gothic story that for me appeals to more of a modern reader, because the writing, while it definitely stays consistent, it doesn't bog the reader down in that classic style that can be really hard to get into. I thought the story was very immersive. It moved at a good pace. The writing and the prose was very well done, but not overly flowery or anything like that. And again, I thought it was really interesting to see how these stories were reinterpreted. And I'm not someone who normally likes retellings. I am someone who has read Dracula, and it is one of my favorite classics, but I have not read Frankenstein, and I don't know if I will, just because of the age of the classic. I don't think that the prose will work for me, but I will say that I think people who have read either or both of the classic stories will enjoy this one the most, or rather get the most out out of it. But as long as you are generally aware of the premise of both stories, you can definitely go into the story and enjoy it as a standalone without having to go back first to read the classic works. So I really enjoyed it. Highly recommend. A bit of a hidden gem in my opinion, and yeah, I thought it was a lot of fun. Then for my Patron book club, which is always linked down below if you want to join us, we did a couple of buddy reads. The main one for the month was The Winter People by Jennifer McMahon. I have recently talked about this book several times on my channel, so I'm going to leave it pretty short and say that it is a horror suspense book told over two timelines, one being the present day where sisters are looking for their mother who has disappeared on a blizzarding day, and then we go back to the past where a couple, after years of infertility, have a child, but something goes horribly wrong one day and they have to deal with the consequences of that. I've said many times before that this is one of my favorite horror books, my favorite horror books by women, which is why it was on my list the other week. But I haven't read this book in years, so it was a really good excuse to return back to it, and I gotta say that it held up very well. I understand why other people will call it a thriller and not technically horror, but in my mind, while it's not the most horrifying book out there, I definitely think that it hits on the tropes of the genre, and I feel very comfortable to classify it that way. And I gotta say, it totally held up for me. I had a lot of fun reading it, and in the past my criticism is that I didn't love the present day perspective, but rereading it I enjoyed it a lot more because I saw how it tied into the story that was set in the past and how they worked together, and I really did like the ending. Perhaps a little bit different than some of the endings I normally love, but in this case I thought it worked out really well. The other book we read together as the book club was a bonus read, and that was Pretty Girls by Karin. This is a thriller that once again was a reread for me. We picked it up in honor of our friend Sandy, who was a patron of our book club and a really good friend who passed away in this last year, and so in memory of her we decided to pick up one of her favorite thrillers, and knowing her black-hearted taste, she loves her thrillers really dark. So this is a thriller that is told over a few different perspectives. Primarily we follow two sisters that had a falling out years ago when one of them married a man who the other one had accused of doing some terrible things. And after this husband dies, right at the beginning of the story, they find out the terrible things about this man's past, and terrible things ensue from there. This is a book that I don't want to spoil too much of the plot, but I do need to give huge content warnings for rape and sexual assault. This book is not for everyone. I don't think that the author tries to glorify those aspects, but they are definitely there, so I do need to give a harsh warning to anyone who is on the fence about picking this one up, that it definitely deals with some tough aspects of those situations. And so I've got to say that it was an interesting one to reread with the book club. I enjoyed the twists and turns, and I remember not liking it that much. I think I only gave it 3 stars the first time I read it. This time I enjoyed it so much more. I gave it a solid 4 stars. I still prefer False Witness because while it deals with a lot of the same themes, I feel like False Witness does it better. But overall, I really enjoyed this one. I would recommend it if you haven't read it yet. I think the audiobook version is great, and I'm just really glad that my book club got a chance to read it together and do it so in memory of our dear friend Sandy. Next, I want to talk about My Dark Vanessa by Kade Elizabeth Russell, and this is more of a general fiction novel than a thriller, just because in my opinion it is meant to discuss some very difficult subject matter rather than thrill and entice the reader. But I gotta say that this book left quite an impact on me, and this is the book that I was really reluctant or hesitant to even want to discuss in this video, and even more reluctant to admit how much I enjoyed it, because I feel like enjoyed is the wrong word to describe this book, or at least the experience I had with it. If you aren't familiar, this book follows a young woman. It is set over 2 timelines, one being the present day where she finds out that a professor or a teacher that she knew from her days at boarding school has been accused of sexual assault of some young students, and she is in denial of those crimes. And then you find out that as a student years ago, she had what I will call a relationship with him. Of course, she was underage, so the word relationship is really inappropriate, and really what was involved was pedophilia. And this is a really complicated story to read because we read it from the perspective of the victim. However, the victim themselves does not see themselves that way, at least at the beginning of the story. They don't think that the man did did anything wrong and just have a very warped perspective of what happened all those years ago. This is a book that is very much inspired by the classic of Lolita, as the author mentions right at the beginning of the book. And I gotta say right off the bat that while I found this book to be absolutely fascinating, I was immersed in the story and could not look away, I do fully understand that this book is not for everyone. There is nothing wrong with admitting that you do not want to read this book because, again, huge content warnings. And I think for those of you with teenage daughters or any history surrounding this topic, or just simply someone who just does not want to read about this subject matter, that is perfectly fine. So feel free to skip over to the next book. I always have the images so that you can see when to move on to the next one. But if you are at all interested in picking up this book and have not yet done so, I will let you know that I thought it handled the subject matter very well, in my opinion, at least in the fact that it really dealt with the complexity surrounding it. This book dealt with it in a very nuanced way, which I found very surprising. I thought that some of the choices the author made were very daring, and I was also surprised how explicit the book is, because it does not shy away from the realities of what that situation involved, and it has some really, really uncomfortable scenes. And that's why I think I like the book so much, because again, I hate to use the word liked, but I appreciate a book that can make me that uncomfortable, and this book made my skin crawl. It just gave me the chills, it made me want to put it down, it made me feel dirty, and it's the kind of book that you just want to look away from, but you know that these situations exist, you know that these conversations need to come out, and this book is very much a conversation surrounding the Me Too movement, and I think it's a very important book to be out there. But I fully acknowledge that just because this book should exist, I don't think that everyone should read it. So be very careful whether or not you decide to pick it up. But wow, did it leave an impact on me. Easily one of the best books I've read so far this year. 4.5 stars, nearly perfect, and I'm definitely going to be thinking about this book for a long, long time. Moving on to something lighter, we have Rock, Paper, Scissors by Alice Feeney, and this is a thriller that follows a couple that go to the Scottish Highlands to have a weekend away, and they are just trying to save their marriage. They are at a point where it is breaking down. The story is told over multiple perspectives, so we get the perspective of the husband as well as the wife, and you also get these journal entries from the wife, or letters that they were writing each year for their anniversary to their husband. And the story is one that I really like, the narrative structure of it, because again, you're told from the perspective of one character, and they will confess things to you as the reader. And then when you switch perspectives, you will find out that certain things that appeared one way from one person's perspective is actually quite different from the other. And it's hard to describe this book without just having read it, but you will have it where something happens and it appears to be one way, and then you switch perspectives and realize, no, something else was going on, but you didn't know it until that point. So I loved the setup to this one. I thought it was really smart and well plotted in that way, but I'm conflicted how I feel about it as a whole, because I didn't totally love the ending. It had some good aspects to the twists and turns within the story, but then there was also moments that I felt were very clunky, and I just didn't understand why they were in there. The story deals with some interesting different aspects to it. So for instance, the husband is face blind so that he cannot actually recognize his own wife, and there's always a question of how is that going to tie into the story, how is that going to be meaningful. And it was enjoyable to go through and find out the conclusion to the story. I just don't think I love the conclusion as much as other readers, because I've seen people give this 5 stars and it wasn't that for me. It was more like 3.5. Finally, we have The Overnight Guest by Heather Gudenkauf, and this is a story that's told over a few different perspectives, one being the present day, where we follow a true crime writer who is out writing in this isolated cabin on this blizzarding day. They go outside and discover that there is a young child out there. They bring them in and try to figure out what happened. The story also has a second or other perspective, and eventually you see how they tie together. This is a book that I will say is perhaps not the most unpredictable. I think that if you read a lot of thrillers, you can probably piece it together, but I do have to admit that I did not actually fully see how the stories connected. I saw parts of it, but there were other things that went over my head, and there were some really good surprises. I found this book just to be really fun. I enjoyed going along with the narrative. I thought it was well paced and well plotted, and overall just enjoyed it. So I don't think, again, it wasn't a 5-star read for me, but it was still really solid and one of the better thrillers I have read in a while. So I would recommend it. I really have enjoyed this author in the past and do want to read more by them. So I would recommend this one if you're a fan of thrillers. I thought this one was really enjoyable. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to hear of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out? And please help me decompress my feelings about Dead Silence as well as My Dark Vanessa, because I have some really complicated feelings going on. And even as I record this video, my feelings towards both the books continue to shift as I continue to mull them over in my brain. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror, thrillers, science fiction, and fantasy. You can help me out still by giving this video a thumbs up, sharing it around online, dropping a comment, even if it's just a little emoji like a ghost. And if you hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss another video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.